Welcome to Belonging. And anything I say in my workshop that's going to be Latinx related, and I'll define that soon, or LGBTQ related, I need you to both understand that it's important to know these things for those communities in particular. But if you think that these things are only appropriate for those communities, you are doing exactly what I'm asking you not to do. So Latinx ministry or LGBTQ ministry, which in itself are bad terminology because they're hyphenated, or ministry. It is ministry, it is ministry, it is ministry. Anytime we add a tag to it, we are saying that something else is normative ministry, right? So anything I say in terms of an example that is Latinx or LGBTQ, just think that that is something that there's some kernel there, or the whole thing, that is applicable to ministry, to evangelism, to liturgy, etc. So we'll switch. Stephanie this morning, and she said briefly that she wanted to think about solidarity, and I was glad that she did that because oftentimes we talk about welcome and inclusion, and we can have a conversation in a moment as to whether that's enough or not. And my slides are working. Yeah. Whether that's enough. So I want to focus a little bit on the ideas and actions behind solidarity and belonging. Right? So in this description of the workshop, I talked about how we have leaders in our church, leaders. And some of you may be these very people, or in this conference, we have leaders in our church. They're Episcopalians, they're committed Christians having communion on Sunday, right? Pledging, active in all ways that you can imagine, who do not have a sense of belonging in their church. Who, when you give them an opportunity somewhere to share their faith story, you're amazed. As clergy, those of us who are clergy, that might happen sometimes when you're in the car with somebody, you know, or when you have a little breather, but none of this belonging stuff is happening on Sunday morning. It's not. We're like all facing in the same direction generally, right? We say, let's say these prayers silently are allowed. I hope you don't say that ever again. No, I want to know what my neighbor is praying for. Because if I don't know what they're thinking about at 2 o'clock in the morning, or what brings them joy, you know, we're not in solidarity and we're not creating belonging with one another. That's about relationship. So we have to build some common language. Okay? So the next slide, please. What is welcome? This is interactive. No rhetorical questions. A couple examples of welcome. Introduction and invitation. Anything else? Meeting them at the door. You've seen my church. That's crucial because you can't find where the sanctuary is. All-inclusive bulletin, right? And we'll have to think about what that means. Okay. Great. All right. Sure. Next slide, please. So we're thinking about hospitality, right? And hospitality, as I think it was Stephanie or Juan mentioned this morning, still has a us-them dynamic. It's like you're coming into my home. I'm setting a spread for a reception, right? So I'm a person, as Lori could tell you, that I have a lot of useless information in my brain. That's the problem with baseball fans. But what year, don't turn it over yet, what year was the slogan and related signs the Episcopal Church welcomes you approved in tech? Nope. 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 Why was approved? Can you do the next slide, please? 1950. It used to be called National Council, now it's Executive Council. And this is a little tidbit from the Living Church. Durable unless shot at. A model of the proposed Episcopal Church welcome sign was set up in the council's meeting room. It consisted of a standard with a base and an arm from which the sign hangs. Mr. Jordan explained that the sign was, 1, a road sign to be placed at the entrance of a town, 2, a street sign to be put in the immediate neighborhood of the church, and 3, a church sign to be placed on or very near the church. The model was finished with aluminum paint, the lettering on the sign being distinct. The only colors were the red cross of the church seal below the words the Episcopal Church welcomes you, and the blue field below the seal for the name of the particular church or churches, St. Matthew and St. Timothy. Mr. Jordan said the sign with standard would last 10 years unless shot at or hit with a rock. The cost would be about $28 without shipping expense. The council members were interested in the sign, but several expressed a fear that boys would use it for target. One member suggested that it be given a cement base in order that it might not be carried away on Halloween or at any other time. The council then voted approval of the sign. It was 1950. The research librarian at GTS helped me find this because it's so ubiquitous in our culture that it just is. You know, this is the earliest reference that we could find, and obviously it's when it was approved at Executive Council, and it was not approved at General Convention. So, you know, but I asked once on Facebook, and I got the same kind of response. Usually, the response was, when did you become aware of these signs that Episcopal Church welcomes you? So, the concern that I have with this is that if we've been saying this since 1950, fill in the blank. So, right. Yeah. So it's welcome enough. Outside in the table at Church Publishing, there's a book, Beyond the Binary God, a Theology for Trans Allies. I highly recommend it. It is such a good read that I read it during the Triduum this past year. And talked to the author and says, how did you find time? And it's like every time I was on the bus or something, I read it. But it's a good read. So I know this is a very long quote, but it's worth reading. Many churches are becoming much more welcoming for members of the trans community. And God knows we need to be more welcoming. But is it not enough simply to welcome? To welcome them into our congregation is to imply somehow that this is our church, we're the host and they're the guests. To place them in the role of guests is to require them to behave in socially acceptable ways and to follow the rules of the house they are visiting. To welcome them as guests is to imply that we have the right to invite them and not invite them, or not to invite them. To welcome them as guests is to proclaim that they are not really a part of the family. You get the point, right? Welcome is not enough. Welcome is not messy enough, right? Welcome doesn't break down the barriers of host and guest. So we get to the language that we've been seeing for, the next slide please, that we've been seeing for a while now, right? For about 20, 25 years, we've been talking about inclusion. So most corporate headquarters have some diversity and inclusion segment that is part of their human resources, etc. So this is the language, right? So what are a couple of examples of inclusion? Not a rhetorical question again.
Like using all sorts of colors for God.
Okay. Does expansive language for God. Okay.
Usually the person who's preaching to them, like in my church, the person who's preaching to them as a man, they often tend towards she, her most of the time. If they're gonna more them, they will say him. But
Cool.
yeah,
So expansive language.
expensive language.
What else?
It also comes with a
Okay, cool. Sure. Change the canon. Can you do the next slide? Where are we as a church? Assuming the model of inclusion, right? Exclusion, segregation, integration, inclusion. Can you do the next one, please? Do we engage Latinx persons in community? So Latinx, there's a long history between on census categories. In 1980, disparate, non-homogeneous community was named Hispanic to be put in the census. That evolved into Latino because the Spanish language is a binary language. Sometimes they talk about Latino-A, Latino/A, or use the @ sign. But Latinx goes to the next level, which is an inclusive non-binary ending to the word. So that's what. Well, Latinx persons and communities, but it's inclusive of any gender identity or expression, right? So it's not male or female binary. So often I talk about that we have made the move to talk about inclusive language. Used to be inclusive gender of female, right? And now we're asking people of goodwill to think not just inclusive in a binary gender system, that go beyond that, which requires a whole language change. That'll be some other Forma conference. So in exclusion, the majority of ministry in the Episcopal Church that has to do with Latinx persons is actually exclusion. Okay. Next slide, please. Do we serve or minister to Latinx persons and communities? That's still segregation of some sort. And the next, do we minister with Latinx persons and communities? That might be some level of integration. And then the next, do we minister among Latinx persons and communities? Historically, if we look at it as a church historian, which I am, we have in some ways moved from to with to among, but we are primarily still in the to, and I'll get to why that is, right? And you can think about this in any context, not just Latinx, right? Is that there are people that we serve, they're hungry, that make us feel good for doing that, right? There are communities we work with. You know, lots of people work with me or with Hugo. And there are collaborations that have a work with everybody. So let me move here to the next slide. So Stephanie made this point earlier, it's inclusion in us. I think inclusion still speaks of an us-them dynamic, right? It still has the us-them dynamic. And one of the deep frustrations that I have in the Episcopal Church is that within our Anglican tradition, we could even say all the way back to the Synod of Whitby in the 7th century, is that we have had an ethos of both and, you know, where we have been able to hold things in tension with one another, where it's not a sellout, it's a both and. It's multiple things can be lifted up. It's actually the actual definition of ambivalence It's not wishy-washy. It's just holding things in tension is what ambivalence is, right? So we get to the next slide. So kind of like solidarity. So solidarity, what does solidarity look like? Deacons, come on, what does solidarity look like? Arm locked. Okay, that's a perfect one. So that next, that's a very good one. I'm going to keep mental note of that. So, next slide, please. Sorry. Well, solidarity is a sacramental act. So we have sacraments and sacramental acts. Our sacraments are baptism and Eucharist. Our sacramental acts are all the other sacraments and anything else that's sacramental, right? Anything else that puts a thinginess to an inward something, right? So the outward and visible sign of inclusion is solidarity. When you show up for people, right? The next slide. So this is Pride last summer in Colombia. And can anybody tell me where Michael Curry is on the right? Where? No, not where he is, but where did that event happen? Yeah, General Convention last summer. It's a lot of Episcopalians feeling good, huh? I mean, I'm being tongue-in-cheek. That is great. That's witness. Approaching solidarity, but that's a good witness, especially when we are powerful. You know, we have influence. But in Colombia, Pride, at the detention center, I know a lot of people felt the prayers. No. It was my understanding. I was not there, but my understanding it was choreographed in a way because there were permissions that were needed, and people ended up not being able to be where they wanted to be. I'm not sure there were a lot of Latinos there. Yeah. 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 So to differentiate it, and that's great to know, right? Who's Michael Curry talking to? Us. He's talking to us. That's important. That's formation, right? Priests are in churches forming people to be able to go outside and being sent forth, right? But we tend to feel good about this conversation that we're having, even the one we're having right now, right? But this is easy, no matter how hot it is, right? This is easy. It's important, but does it go far enough, right? Oh no, I'm not. I'm just saying that that's not the best picture to have there. The next slide, please. Putting our values into action, right? How we show up for people, how we put our values into action. Discomfort over comfort. So at the Church of St. Matthew and St. Timothy, we're a multicultural bilingual congregation, English and Spanish. And there are parishioners that hate bilingual liturgy and love having it. And it's because they value being together over the comfort that they could have in a monolingual service, right? So if we, as the panelists said earlier this afternoon, if we go to church to be comfortable, that's a problem. We should go to church to be uncomfortable for Christ. So the great enemy of the truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth. Persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. Too often we hold fast to the cliches of our forebears. We subject all facts to a prefabricated set of interpretations. We enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. Church should be a place of discomfort. Being comfortable in diversity actually means being comfortable with discomfort. Liturgy. This is a conference about liturgy. And I'm bringing the Latinx perspective. So there is a consideration about spoken and written language in liturgy. I want to say something about, there's been a back and forth about, I wasn't here at worship yesterday, but about whether music was printed or not. There is a third factor. I will bring a third view into this. Is if I cannot see a person speak, and it's art or music, whether in English or in Spanish, I do not understand it. Unless I know it, if I can't see it, I will not understand, especially if it's music or poetry being said. If I can't access the face, I can't process the language. So using sometimes paper is both a hindrance because culturally we don't listen. So scripture people are following along. But having paper in multiple forms of image in it also can help other people. And it's just a different level of inclusion. That has nothing, that just has to do with processing language, right? So I understood both things. You know, in England, they don't print the notes. You just print the words. So the hymnal structure for us, 1982 hymnal, is not an Anglican thing necessarily. Very idiosyncratic to us. But some of us who are used to it can do it even if we don't read music. Right? So, next thing. But to think about language in terms of bilingualism or in having inclusion of multiple things, we have to think about it in multiple ways. Listening. I took 2 years of Arabic, 4 semesters at UC Berkeley, Monday through Friday. I can't understand a lick of it, not by ear, and I can't speak it. I can read it. Right? So listening, people who understand Spanish may not read Spanish or speak Spanish. Yeah, speaking, and the next one, reading. Those are all different levels of understanding language. So I have a friend who's a speech pathologist, and they were trying to evaluate some bilingual kids who were dropping letters at the end, and whether that was like a speech thing or not a speech thing. And the curious thing for me was that since, although they spoke Spanish but had not studied in Spanish, thus read Spanish, did the speech pathologists themselves, could they recognize the difference between what was on the page and what was being said, which is the difference that they understand in the ear, right? So when we do our bulletins at the church, we try to account for many things. Our Spanish language bulletin has a cross-page thing for the English BCP, right? Our bilingual bulletins present music with text with music on one side, text on the other, regardless of the language. and some translation to give it like a hint as to what it is if it's in the other language. Readings are on both sides, English and Spanish. So if something is read in one language, the other person has the other. But I have a parishioner who can't see, and she's monolingual English. That one I haven't been able to solve because my congregation is very small. So we would need simultaneous device to be able to do that for somebody who is hard of sight or hard of hearing, sometimes both. So the next slide, please. The I is not bilingual. That's the clearest way. A lot of people who can speak Spanish, I live in New York City. A lot of my grandkids of grandparents who immigrated in the 70s, the grandkids can respond in Spanish maybe. They can't read it. So the assumption that you just put a piece of paper in front of them and that's accessible is huge. So think about the ways in which you are taking language for granted and how to make sure that includes the broadest number of people. Next slide, please. Latinx. So I spoke about this already. There's a huge controversy in the Latino Hispanic Ministries Facebook that has gone on for a year or some as to whether Latinx should be used, should it not be used, what's the grammar of it, yada, yada, yada. My thought is that two things about that is that you can practice writing an inclusive language and in speaking in inclusive ways. And once you do it, you can't go back. And you must do it in English, you must do it in Spanish, it functions differently. But if you want to stand in solidarity right now with the LGBTQ community, and whether you're writing anything down or not, you better be using Latinx. Using that, regardless of what you feel about the grammar of it, you better use it if you want to be in solidarity with me. Because it's a non-inclusive binary. It goes beyond non-inclusive to binary to not non-binary language. And it matters. And it matters to stand up for people. Well, I'll engage with it in a way because I am pretty sure that I did not choose she, her, hers. Because, well, I don't know. Another bilingual language processing thing that is unique to me is that, and I have taught Spanish, is that if I see she, her, hers, I am like completely worried right now as to what that means grammatically. And I can't bring it up. And the ella, like it just messes me up. So I say, so long as you don't curse at me, you can use whatever pronoun. But it's important, right? It's important. And it has to do with the pronoun, the possessive, and the, what's the third? Anybody? Exactly. Try to do that bilingually. Yeah. I teach Spanish and I still can't get for me, you know. The next slide, please. Okay. Why does it matter? One of the ways, because this is about our families, extended families, and Jesus. It's about us, right? Don't you all want to belong? Do you think about this? We could have a huge whole day here about exploring for each one of us the level of belonging you feel in your congregation right now or in the Episcopal Church. It also has to do about how the Episcopal Church treats Latinx people in communities. I thought when I was going to seminary that the issue was going to be that I was queer, and when I got to seminary, and ever since, so for 22 years now, the background that I've been pushed back into continually is the fact that I'm Puerto Rican, right? And the church can't get it. And the difference is that they're white men who are gay, who have always been in the structures of power. So the queer issue tends to have this tension with it that you can't really push it because there's people in power that, so it's taboo in a different way. But the Latino stuff is not taboo at all. It functions all the time. Next slide, please. So why is it about us? It's because intersectionality. Somebody mentioned that everybody has some sort of margin, right? We're not one thing. We are, I love this word. This is my favorite word lately. It's polycentric. We have polycentric identities that all go together with one another. And we have all these ways to order the world, not just the sacred and the profane, but order the world, right? In which we have to continually order the world without reifying that order and then creating a bias system as to why we created that order in the first place. So racism is not about whether there are people that have black and brown skin, because black and brown skin exists, but it's the fact that a bias has been created as to the capabilities of people that have brown and black skin. And it doesn't even have to be brown and black skin, because I've had people, and this is not about me, but it's funny because I've had people literally stop talking to me if they find out that I'm Puerto Rican. Because in the conversation, it's like, okay, see you. And it's almost like because they feel defrauded, right? That I've been a fraud. Because they should have figured it out. Because they should have known, right? I say that I don't have a hubcap under my arm. That's why they don't know I'm Puerto Rican. And I've been told that's very 80s. And New York. Next slide, please. I want to get to conversation. I'm still confused as to until what time we have. 4? Oh, okay. Oh, that's great. That's awesome. How we show it for people, putting our values into action. We talked about discomfort over comfort, spoken and written language, to think about the variabilities of language. Buildings and facilities and accessibility. So at St. Matthew's and St. Timothy's, our meal program happens in our parish hall, right? And I love that. I love that it happens in the same space, but mechanically, it requires our guests for the meal program to stay outside until we're done with coffee hour. Just because of the logistics of the space. So we are using the same space, but at the same time, we are controlling the use of public space, right? Children in church, culturally, regionally, etc., the presence of children in church varies, right? For some Latinx families, if you are trying to take their kids away in the middle of worship, that's not going to happen, right? So being aware, even if that should happen anymore, right? I wish we had kids to be able to have to grapple with that, but music. We've heard a little bit today in terms of what is appropriation, what isn't appropriation, what is solidarity in terms of music, how do we expand our language, how do we expand our comfort zone, and try to learn new music, and how do we do that? So those are all other ways. In a different context, I've done a trans inventory. It's like walk through your building and through your communications, through your website and all that, and how inclusive is it? You know, how welcoming it is in terms of language, space, all aspects, worship language, etc. Next slide, please. The bathroom issue, right? It's huge. You'd be surprised. I include this. This is not specific Latinx. Actually, it's not even specific LGBT, but it really ultimately is about access to public spaces. You know, we have an accessible bathroom that we limit its use out of practicality, you know, but we also have a school, so we can't have non-gender specific bathrooms because the city ordinance requires separate gender bathrooms. So how do you navigate all of these things? But it is ultimately about access to public spaces. Segregated fountains, segregated spaces was about access to public space. The bathroom stuff, with trans folk in particular, is about access to public space. You know, it's that's just the truth. And the thing is, if you are an opposite gender caregiver, or if you're an aunt with a 5-year-old nephew going through an airport and use a family bathroom, which makes sense, right? But there's no privacy in a family bathroom at all. There's not like a little partition, you know, so you've got your 5-year-old boy, you know, and it's like my own insecurities about everything, you know. So the bathroom stuff is like practical too. If you're opposite gender, you have a family member in a wheelchair, you know, so it's more expensive. Take Kroger. When this all exploded down in North Carolina, Kroger immediately had all these signs that had all the ways in which non-gender specific bathrooms work, and the last one was for trans folks. It's like because the list was like very long. Next slide, please. For bathrooms? I haven't cracked it. I'm a gender non-conforming person, so I love bathrooms that are not gender specific. There are trans folks that come to our program, but I can't make an announcement, come talk to me, because that, in a way, putting them in the spot. So there are some serious limitations with our bathrooms, especially with city ordinances. So at Union, which is just an odd building, they have gendered bathrooms in the basement level, but there's a sign next to each that says where you can go for a non-gender specific bathroom in the facility, if you can figure your way around. Yeah, but where I struggle is how do you let people know that without then setting them aside, pointing them out, and then literally increasing the safety situation. Sextons need to be educated about this. Older people need to be educated about this. Everyone needs to be educated about this. I mean, the thing is with kids, with little kids, New York City, you know, we think we're in a bubble. And I've had little kids do a double take and literally go to their parents, Mommy, that poor girl, you know? And I kind of chuckle at it, but it's early in which we categorize. And different people, I have a trans man in my congregation, and he is so patient with everybody. He gets misgendered all the time. And my mind boggle around that is that he came in as a trans man. Like, nobody ever met him before transitioning, but immediately made a series of connections. And he's super, they're protected. They don't necessarily know why, but they can't change their language. And I am like shackled because it's not, I'm like, what do you want me to do? Oh, it's okay. You know, sacramental nature of the church, solidarity, showing up for people. In your bulletins, in your sermons, inclusive language. I'm taking this is embarrassing. I'm taking a dancing class, and the reason I never learned to dance salsa, and I'm Puerto Rican, was because I didn't have a way to learn to dance the lead part, right? So I finally have taken up the nerve to like do this, and I go to the class, and if anybody has ever taken a dance class, this is my first time, so I'm making it normative. It's like the first half of the class, you're by yourself. So everybody's there, 100 people are doing this by themselves. And then you pair up, right? And in between, it's like, oh, gentlemen, come here and let's practice. And it's like a push-pull the whole time, because it's like, do I step in there? Do I not step in there? But I don't want to learn this other thing. Is it safe? Is it not safe? And can this dude change his language, please? Because then it's all about him and his girlfriend, and it's like, you know? But it's hard. It's hard, especially because I'm in tune to it. And it's like, oh my God. And let's not do that. Next slide, please. Belonging. Sense of belonging. When you belong, what does that feel like? Cozy? You matter? You're understood? Okay. My frustration. Yeah. Yeah. And it's in Harlem, which then creates all sorts of, belonging. Hugo knows this story. 2 years ago, 3.5 years ago at Nuevo Amanecer, which is the Latino Hispanic Ministries Conference of the Episcopal Church, happens at Canuba. And because I'm me, I insisted on doing a plenary on inclusion. And it had been just after HB2 had been passed, so I was very angry that we were there, and that what kind of safety were we going to do. So we did a plenary, which was fantastic. We had like 400 people attend. It was amazing. It was so good. It's on YouTube somewhere. And then we were going to do workshops the next day, and the workshop process was the same workshop repeated in the morning and afternoon. So we get to the morning session, and I introduced myself. Nicole Garcia, who's a Lutheran pastor, introduced herself, and we start going around the room. And this happens in queer settings. Everybody starts sharing their coming out story. But it was more than that. And I'm an engineer by background, so I'm like worried about time. And then, I'm worried about the fact that I prepared, and I think my things that I want to say are important, and that now time is like fleeting. And I'm just anxious. I'm anxious, and it's going, right? And I can tell this story in a longer way, but about 2/3 of the way into our time, I say, I know some of you are like really anxious, and I am too, but this is important, and let's continue. So we did that. So everybody just shared, right? And if I'm 6 o'clock, this young person from Bakersfield, California was at about 11, and he was the only person in the room who just said his name. He didn't say anything. And we had a caucus during lunch where they gave us a table with 8, and all of a sudden 30 people wanted to sit in the caucus, so we had to go into that back room in Canuga, if you've ever been there. And we have lunch. And it's like just so cool, right? So then I got to get ready for my workshop in the afternoon, and about half of the people have been there in the morning because they still wanted to do the workshop, and half the people are new. So I'm explaining to the people what happened in the morning and that we couldn't do that in the afternoon, right? Because people did come to learn something about solidarity, how to be in solidarity. And the same thing happened. And the same gentleman from the morning was seated about 3 o'clock. I always get choked up about this, and this is the reason why I do this workshop. Is everybody share the story. Those in the morning were briefer. So we get to this guy, and he starts by saying, "My dad knew that I was gay from the day I was born, and he beat me for it every day of my life. And I finally came out when I tried to commit suicide, and my mom was at my bedside." So just floor drop, right? And I'm sitting there and I'm like, this person is a leader in their church. You're not new to the Episcopal Church when you go to Nuevo Amanecer, right? You're a leader in the church. We did a plenary last night. We did a workshop this morning. We had lunch together. And 2/3 of the way through this workshop in the afternoon, it's the first time he is able to share something with the group of that level of depth, right? So imagine in our churches how many opportunities we have to reach that level of depth. We don't have them, right? Because we educate, all of you are educators, right? So we educate. We have something important to share, right? When all we need to do sometimes is prompt and allow for the conversation to happen, right? Because if we can't feel that the person next to me knows something about me, I can lead because many of us just like to be in charge of stuff, right? Right? How do I belong? You know people's immigration story, single moms raising their kids, worries, mundane and deep, right? Which is why the whole idea about praying out loud, I think, is very important. At least into not passive aggressive praying out loud, which is like, and so is in the hospital, and the priest is up front going, "I wish I would have known," but they're basically telling you that you hadn't done this yet, right? But Brenda Husson, who's director of St. James Madison Avenue, who's an amazing priest, she has a practice with her vestry in which at the start of every vestry meeting, everybody has to pray out loud some concern and some thanksgiving. The tight-knitness of that community and the work they can then proclaim is huge. It's huge. Because people, even in a church with as many people as St. James, they care about each other. Sorry, I thought I was going fast and then I'm talking too much. So we'll do the next slide. Talked a little bit about this. Next slide, please. What are the barriers to belonging? If you preach on Sunday, one text to preach on Sunday is what would have been like, what is Jesus doing with turning water into wine? What's happening community-wise that is the result of having water into wine, which is not intoxication? All the healing miracles that Jesus does, all the manifestations of Jesus as the Son of God, or the child of God, are ways in which he reincorporates people into community, right? So reincorporating people into community doesn't need to be reincorporate. It's like, how do we incorporate people into community if we think they're dirty or that they're speak our language or that we have nothing in common. You get my point, right? So, let's go with church biases toward the next slide, toward Latinx persons and communities. So what limits us in ministry among Latinx persons and communities and continue to focus on ministry too? Those Latinx people and communities are poor and uneducated. They're immigrants, which means they're undocumented and not citizens. 2/3 of Latinx people in the U.S. are U.S. born. They're Roman Catholic, thus, they're from that Spain side of things, not the English side of things. So that battle between empires continues to play out in the Episcopal Church. They're solely Spanish speaking, and they're objects and agents. Let me say something about solely Spanish speaking. Who here has done a hospital visitation at some point? Did you say anything to the person? Always? Always? Okay. You haven't had the opportunity to go visit somebody, they're sleeping, or they can't speak to you, right? Okay. In those occasions in which you didn't utter a word, maybe just a prayer, did you feel you didn't do your job? You do feel you didn't do your job? Sometimes? That doesn't go with what I'm trying to say. Yeah. We know that pastoral care is often about being with people, and that's it. And there's many times in which we have done pastoral care in which we don't have to say a word. One of my best friends is a priest in Charlotte, at Holy Comforter in Charlotte, and she's bilingual. She's whiter than me. If there's a comparison of that, it's not true. And she is so good, so good. Her Spanish is not stellar. It isn't. And there's no doubt when I see it, and when she got married in that parish, it's like she was a priest. And she struggles every time. It's like whether the grammar is just right or, and she's her priest. Like sometimes bishops and rectors use Spanish as a made-up barrier to not engage in this ministry. Just think about anything in your life in which you're not really good at, how much you avoid it. So a lot of men usually feel impotent around language, and unfortunately that's a lot of the bishops in the church. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm. That you should be learning English, right? After the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty in 1848, and the U.S. expanded its territory by taking Mexican territory, the Protestant missions went and had a clear focus that to become Protestant was to become a good citizen and a good American. So learning English, becoming Protestant, were all things that would create good citizens, right? So the assumption is, I don't have to go toward you, you have to go toward me, right? Which is the us-them dynamic. But 2/3 of Latinx people are English speaking, right? It doesn't mean that there's not a place for Spanish language and enculturated liturgy, as Juan would say. Right? There is a place for that. Latinx ethnic identification and religious identification go hand in hand in Latinx communities. There's high level of Latinx identification in communities that have some sort of Latinx identification, right? But it's not solely about that. That's one aspect, but usually it's used as the we can't do it aspect, right? So beware of made up. And isn't that such a cool Guadalupe? Next slide, please. Going beyond us-them dynamic of welcome and inclusion, directional, to toward, with. If you look at the thesaurus of with, it kind of goes in both directions, right? To the both and solidarity and belonging, which is Anglican, is multi-directional with, within, and among. Next slide, please. Here we get to this. Who knows about liberation theology? There's a meeting in Medellin in 1968 which codified the language around liberation theology, and in 1979 there's a meeting in Puebla which further cements it, even though at that point it's no longer within the institution of the church. Anyway, but it's about base communities. And base communities are a place of support, gaining consciousness and agency and inward action, rooted in the worshiping community and sacraments, and outward action in evangelism. That's what we want, right? In mega churches, small groups work inwardly to perpetuate themselves. In liberation theology is like agency for the world, right? Which is what we're trying to do. And in the next slide, it is by some affinity, but it's the place where belonging starts, where you can share your story, where you're empowered. Is not lectures, but mutual learning and enrichment, because everyone has something to contribute in liberation theology. And it's something that I'll email it to you. Yeah. Other practical actions, pray out loud. That's the next slide. Make a commitment to non-binary inclusive language. Consider the all-gender bathrooms, workshops, dismantling Latinx biases, participate in a Pride March, offer an adult education program, make connections across groups. So next slide. In your bags, oh, sorry. Can you go back one? Sorry. I can email this to anybody who wants. So I coordinate a nationwide international organization from the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies and Religion at PSR, which is in Berkeley. I coordinate the Latinx Roundtable. And this is the bag, and here are some materials inside the bag. But something that's not inside the bag, next slide, is the curriculum. I didn't have enough for all the bags, so I do have enough for you for curriculum. And it's a curriculum that goes from welcome, inclusion to solidarity, right? So we talk about our families, who's in our families. We are okay about the Bible, about the work that the Bible is calling us to inclusion, to restore people to community, and the covenant calling us to solidarity with others. Which, if you look at the definition of the beloved community by Martin Luther King Jr., it talks about repentance and reconciliation, which is ultimately, and this is me being a teacher, right? What is the mission of the church? It's missing one piece. On page 855 of the Red Book of Common Prayer. And all people and each other. To restore all people to union with God and with one another in Christ, right? Sounds like reconciliation to me, right? And that is the definition Martin Luther King used in all of his development of the beloved community, is the fulfilling of our mission. Anything that does not fulfill the mission of the church, page 855 of the Red Book of Common Prayer, in my mind is sin. sin is anything that breaks our relationship with God and with one another. So I go to where I started, which was hyphenated ministry is not a thing. That's a program or a project. If you do something hyphenated, children's ministry, youth ministry, and all this, when you're focusing on the youth or the children or LGBTQ or the Latinx, it's no longer ministry. Because ministry is ministry is ministry is ministry. Right? Any time that you separate ministry from anything else, you're making white Episcopal Church perpetuate itself, become normative, and everything else be at the margin. Right? No, I think it's because of the reification of the descriptor to ministry rather than keeping it as a descriptor, right? In Latinx ministry, then, or children's ministry, or young adult ministry, whatever, it's like where's object or agent, right? Do I do Latinx ministry because I'm Puerto Rican? Do I do Latinx ministry because I minister to Puerto Ricans? Like am I object? Do people do Latinx ministry when they engage in conversation with me? Right? I sort of don't like any of those scenarios, right? Because it creates a group of people that can only work in a particular context, and everybody else gets to reap the benefits of everything else. The first step, next slide, is solidarity. The next step is the Latinx gift for the Episcopal Church of Liberation Theology. And then the last slide. So we have 10 minutes. We have 15 for questions. I'm sorry I took longer than 10 minutes. We have time. A little bit of time. Oh. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So I have facilitators guide. So if you take one facilitator's guide and two participants guides, and all this is downloadable from our website. Other questions or comments? Yes. Yeah, I say ministry to, with, and among Latinx persons, to, with, and among children. We need to be clear on what it is that we're doing. We are called to alleviate the suffering of people. And if we do that, that's outreach, and that's fine. We are called to meet the needs of the community around us and in our parish. But if we're doing that as a pretense that we're doing Latino ministry, we're kind of just patting ourselves in the back. It's kind of like going into mission work and spending $20,000 to take a youth group to do missionary work somewhere, rather than giving the people the $20,000 that actually could have made a difference. You made a lot of kids feel good. And that, somewhere we got to have some balance, right? Yeah. Oh.
I want to go back to language for a minute. In my context, we have a diverse congregation, and there's probably about 10 language
that are first languages that are English spoken in my congregation, and it goes from Cantonese to Swahili to Hindi to all of them. So I struggle constantly about the use of language as another thinking that ministry, and we default to English because that's the shared language for the most part. And short of trotting out the languages on Pentecost, which I choose to do, because it feels like, oh, now we're going to recognize them. Quite how to grapple with that.
So one of the strategies that we have bilingual English Spanish at our church is like when we pray together, we do it softly in a soft voice, so we're not competing with one another. So we can easily say it in both English and Spanish. So I would presume that there are opportunities in your worship, especially with the Lord's Prayer, the confession, the Lord's Prayer, the confession, the creed go along, but you can also do it with the creed. And in other opportunities where if it's available in all of those languages, you lower your voice and you share it softly, and it's a cacophony that is not intrusive, but everybody, especially Lord's Prayer, and not assume on the other side that the person that you know speaks another language is going to speak something other than English for those opportunities, right? I've been told, why do you always pray that prayer in Spanish when we're bilingual and that prayer in English? And I'm like, I'm not. But I'm fully bilingual, so somebody switches languages on me, I'll switch in the middle of the sermon, and they'll have to remind me that I've already said that in the other language. But other questions? What? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, so I think you're absolutely right. I think that most resources in English of small group theory have some of this, but are missing the agency piece, the specific agency piece that liberation theology brings in, and the specific purpose of liberation that base communities have. So most of the literature on small group dynamic is for the inward stuff, and it doesn't have the proclamation evangelism piece that inevitably has to come out. So I think it's a recovery or a discovery, DIS-covery, of a liberation theology in the U.S. context, which I think is a gift that Latinos can give to the church. But you understand that difference in it's small groups, but the end result of these small groups is different. The sense of belonging is not so that you have somebody come to dinner at your house. The sense of belonging is that you together are now strengthened to share the good news out in the world because you've been empowered to do so, and people have your back. They know your story. They know that your kid is struggling, like how do we do that? And for clergy, it's hard in our congregation because we... Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this curriculum in the fourth session and in the fifth session is about showing up, right? So recognizing that our families have queer people, that our congregations have queer people, that this is biblically fine. Then now that we've gotten all that out of the way, is how do we that is expressed in our communities, and how do we show up for people. And that is precisely that identification of what are the needs that we can meet in the community. Pride March, for example. I want to say immigration stuff, but remembering that not all Latinx people are immigrants or undocumented, etc. So always being aware of that. Anything else? Thank you. Take the curriculum. Take one facilitator and 2 participants.